Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author, Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Wall Street Journal bestselling author Brianna Labuskes. Brianna writes psychological thrillers and historical fiction. She started her career in journalism and spent more than a decade covering the intricacies of policy and politics on Capitol Hill. She now lives in Asheville with her puppy, Jinx. Welcome, Brianna.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so happy to have you. And we decided we have dogs on both sides. So if there's noise, it's certainly from a puppy. And that's just the way it is for writers, right? Since we live at home and work at home and have to have furry friends. So so before we dig into all my questions about this, because I loved this book and the main character, Gretchen White, who was so fun. Tell our listeners about See It End.
So See It End is the third book in the Gretchen White trilogy. Gretchen is a psychologist, but also a sociopath. And she kind of uses her her personality to solve these crazy crimes. Because she has this unique insight into, criminal minds because she's a sociopath. So the first one dealt with a kid who's a psychopath. And so Gretchen was kind of like the only one who could kind of be on her side because she's like, oh, she's kind of like me. And the second one delves into what happened to Gretchen in her history. And this one is her partner is arrested for a murder. And she's like, I don't believe she did it. So that's kind of a quick overview of all of the three books.
Yeah, and her partner is a Detective Marconi. And not only, really, she's caught on the Ring camera going in the front door of where there is a dead body. So it's really a hard one to escape. And really, even Marconi's, romantic partner, who is in internal affairs, sort of finds it impossible to believe that she didn't actually do this. And of course, she comes to Gretchen and says, I did it, don't investigate, which Gretchen takes with her twisted mind as a like call to investigate. She's like, well, there's absolutely something wrong with her that she told me not to investigate. Meanwhile, her Lachlan, who is the romantic partner, is like, she told you not to investigate. You shouldn't investigate. And Gretchen's like, you clearly don't understand me at all. So it's really fun. And there's a they don't the romantic, the boyfriend Lachlan and Gretchen don't historically get along very well. So it's really fun to see them thrown together. There's lots of wonderful moments of dark humor. And Gretchen is just sharp as a whip. So that is super fun. It's a really fun book. And I have not read the first two books yet, but I felt like I read it and it was one of the tricks about writing series, as you know, and I know, is to make every book it could be read in any order. And then our readers will want to go back and read the earlier books. And that is how I felt with this. I was like, I wasn't lost. There's enough beautifully woven in backstory that I understood who Gretchen was, who Marconi was, how they know each other, that I didn't feel like I was missing anything. So that's kudos to you for that, because that can be really hard.
That's such a relief to hear because this is my first series actually. And so I didn't know, it was just a learning experience essentially of being like,
what's happening over there?
Okay, sorry. He has gotten a squeaker. It's just decided that. Anyways, okay.
I cannot hear his squeaking.
Oh, okay.
I can't.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm just so tuned to it. Okay. Let me start where my series.
First series.
Okay. So this was my first series, and it was a learning experience of trying to figure out how much to put in, how much backstory would bog it down. This is the third book in a series. I wasn't sure how many people were going to be picking it up as a standalone.
Right.
But I've already heard from like a couple of people being like, oh, I read this as like the first book I found out of it. And so I think, I don't know, how do you approach that? I don't it was hard, but I'm glad that it resonated.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me that I know you're known for your standalones. I did not realize this was your first series, and it is a different beast. But we had the same publisher, Thomas and Mercer, who is the imprint of Amazon, and they really love a series. So every time I would write a standalone, Exhume was a standalone, Whiteout was a standalone. Every time I wrote a standalone, they're like, "Let's change the ending a little bit and let's make this a series." And I
I
was
think
like,
it was a
"Okay,
Whiteout
yeah."
yeah.
Whiteout has Far Gone is the second, and the
That's right.
third book in the series comes out in next month. So it's
Oh,
yeah, up close. So it's absolutely, and it was fun. Like I feel like once you get to know a character, I mean, like you sort of fall in love with Gretchen. Like I fell in love with Kylie in that series, and Annabelle Schwartzman in the Exhume series. She's a medical examiner. It's really fun, but you're right. You have to sort of leave enough open that there's an opportunity to take them in a new place. And then I do feel like, I mean, like Bob Dugoni, who is another Thomas and Mercer author, who's a phenom about his series, Tracy Crossway. There's like 10 books in that series.
I just say 10, like, yeah, 8 or 10 or whatever.
I don't know how, and I've talked to him about that. I'm like, I don't know how you do that. But, he's like, and it's true. Like once you sort of turn on the tap of someone's life, there's just a lot there, right? And you can't touch on all of it in a book. So it's just a matter of looking at a sort of different, a different sort of angle, which you did. Interestingly, I would have thought Gretchen's origin story would have been the first book.
I considered that. I really, the way that I found myself into Gretchen as a character was through really enjoying the psychopath kid trope. And
Yeah.
so I almost backed into her because I was like, I had Viola, who's the little psycho kid. And I thought, like, how cool would it be if she was framed? Like, because everyone's like, oh, of course the psychopath kid did it, right?
Right. Right.
And the knife's in her drawer, and
Right.
she killed rabbits and stuff like that. And so who is going to be able to believe her? And I
Right.
thought, oh, like someone who has this experience. And so Viola, her crime story, the center mystery had always been her for this first book. And so it just ended up really working out. I think it pulled readers along, and gave them a really satisfying second book. And then something I heard over and over in the series, how much they liked Marconi's relationship with Gretchen, which was
Yeah.
an interesting choice because they only have them on page together in that first chapter.
Right.
Which is, I mean, in the current timeline,
Yeah.
Marconi well, for people who've read the whole series, you have the meet up from Marconi's perspective, instead of Gretchen's, which was what the first book was. Anyways, and so I really don't have them on the page a lot together. And so, my editor was like, are you sure this is going to work? But, I think you still kind of get their relationship
Yeah.
through,
Through
yeah,
Lachlan and through
yeah,
Gretchen's point of view, absolutely. And yeah, and Marconi is, you have her in, it's her chapters in the past, right? Dealing with sort of what had happened when her son disappeared. And there's, it works, I think, very effectively. And we do imagine that because Gretchen has all these sort of anecdotes about their experiences together and the way that I learned I feel like as much about Lauren Marconi from the chapters in Gretchen's point of view as I did from the chapters in her point of view, because of course she's also a very different person than she was. Lauren is, I mean, than she was when she was living in, in those towns when all that stuff happened. So anyway, I thought it was beautifully done, and it is really, you do a really good job of like really twisty people. I don't know what goes on between those ears, Brianna, but there's some definite those screws are a little loose and for the best in the best possible way. So I was going to ask, like, you mentioned sort of the seed for the first book was, was Viola, this psycho kid, as you call her, which I love. What do you remember sort of the seed for this story? How it came?
Oh, I just knew I knew it was gonna be Marconi's book. I knew that she was gonna get arrested. And then I was like, then you start being like, well, why? And then like you keep asking yourself those questions, like, okay, well, why does Gretchen not think she did it? And like, why wouldn't she have
Right.
done it? All sorts of stuff. I don't want to give too much away, but
Right.
you start kind of when you start asking yourself, the logic, when you start trying to figure out the logic, it just becomes like this you know, these puzzle pieces that click into place. I
Yeah.
actually wrote half of the book, I want to say half the book with a different ending in mind, with a different
Oh.
bad guy. Oh, I don't know if that's too spoilery, but a different bad guy. And so then it ends up kind of being kind of authentic in terms of
Yeah. So
just
talk about that. Like, I mean, when you start a book, do you, I mean, it sounds like you know the ending, and I think that feels true to me too. Like, at least I know sort of the direction I'm heading, but I'm not a good plotter. Do you know the plotter, or you're a pantser? How do you work?
I'm a total pantser too. And I think like when people hear, thriller writers like us like say that, they're like, what? But I like telling myself the story. And so that first draft I always kind of talk about as a really detailed outline.
Mhm.
Um, and I just really can go back and have I have a lot of flexibility when I'm editing. I move chapters and I delete and scenes like without any attachment.
Yeah,
um
killing your darlings easily.
yeah,
That's great.
I don't mind killing my darlings.
Good.
And so, but I do usually have the twist. And again, I usually have like who did it, who done it. Or at least like why, like whatever the question is, I
Hmm.
usually have the answer. And two books where I changed who it was like halfway through. And so it's just interesting. I don't know. I was writing it and it's not necessarily like the big twist changed, but like a smaller twist changed. And because I was like, oh, this is boring. Like sometimes I'm like, oh, this is boring. Like if I do it this way, it's gonna be boring. And so then I have to think through like, oh, what will make it interesting. So
Well, you
yeah.
did it. I mean, I think the way that you ended it was really good. So I don't know what you had in mind before, but I think I'm going to just say I think this was the right ending. It was really effective. So I really enjoyed that. Now, is this so, since you're normally a standalone author, how do ideas come to you? Like, where do you find sort of the inspiration for a story? Because I feel like once you're in a series, you're kind of like, at least you're sort of boxed into what your choices are because you
Yeah.
already know the people. But when you're writing a standalone, it seems like the sky's the limit. So
Yeah,
how?
the world is your oyster.
Yeah, and
It's
that can
kind of
be
one of
both.
the fun parts, right?
It's fun, but it's also kind of terrifying if there's so many options. So how do you normally sort of come up, upon ideas?
So it's kind of weird for me, but it's place based. And so like, for example, I was just going through the New York Times one day, like their photo essays, and I found this beautiful photo essay of these islands off the coast of Maine. And like 20 people lived there, right? And they were so haunting. Like they like empty playgrounds and like one room schoolrooms and stuff like that. And I thought, oh my gosh, like what a cool place to set a crime. And so then you start like, oh, what is the crime? Who are the people? And
Yeah.
like that kind of stuff. And then like the next one that I did after that was I was watching a documentary about this shield laws, they're called, and like they're it's set in Idaho, and like so parents are allowed to not give their children medical treatment because of these laws that exist, and there's like 5 states that still have it. And so it's just really awful legislation fight in Idaho going on, and I was like, oh, like what a cool. So it's usually place based for me, which is kind of weird. It's like less about like, oh, a twist. It's more like everything kind of plays a part of where the setting is and what characters would live there and like what outside pressures are in on this crime. So
It's interesting because you spent so long in DC dealing with policy,
yeah.
so you kind of are drawn to these things where there's like a real conflict with sort of what the policy is versus what's morally right, right? Not taking care of not giving your children medical attention seems to be something that is um, not right in my mind anyway. So it's a great opportunity to twist a story from that for sure.
It is, and it ended up being like 2 or 3 months after or before my book came out, like a kid in Tennessee, which was one of the 5 states, died of cancer because their parents didn't want them to get treatment. And it was just like right out of the headlines. So it's not necessarily like it was like these obscure cases. It is because it's 5 states, but like it wasn't like completely obscure story.
No, no.
And to be able to like be like, well, what if there was a murder in that community? How would they tell the difference? And so
Right.
that's when you start thinking those ideas, is when you start generating other like plot bunnies and threads and stuff like that.
Did you call them plot bunnies?
Yeah, plot bunnies.
I've never heard that, Brianna. What's a plot bunny?
It's I have no idea where the term came from. It just like came out of my mouth. But it's in like fanfic communities. I don't know if you know anything about fan fiction, but plot bunnies are kind of like ideas that you're going to have like in the future, or like that come into play, like plot thread lines essentially.
Okay.
And so they just call them plot bunnies. I don't know why.
I love it. I'm gonna have to try to use that in my life, in my future life. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So let's talk. This is something you're really known for, which is this sort of like really a lot of knowledge about psychology and personality disorders. We were talking about it a little bit before we started recording, because obviously Gretchen White is. And we of course have read stories about psychopaths, right? We or sociopaths. You would think of Silence of the Lambs and all sorts of ones, but you do seem to know a lot about, sociopaths, psychopaths, serial killers. Is this a natural interest that you developed over all these books? Did you study it? How did you, how do you learn?
Yeah, so it kind of is a combination. I was always interested in psychology. I almost majored in psychology. And then they're like, well, these are the statistics classes that you have to take if you major in psychology. And I was like, no, thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
But I had I actually took college classes when I was in high school on it. And so like, I've just always been super fascinated by psychology. And so when you're interested in something, you end up gravitating towards nonfiction, like podcasts, movies, all sorts of stuff. And so I've just been I don't know, since I was in high school, just kind of consuming all sorts of abnormal psychology content. And so, yeah, I really love diving into it. I think it's so fascinating. One of the things that I specifically researched for Gretchen was sociopathy. And they don't really call it that. So like, I'm kind of sorry for anyone who's like, like an actual psychologist listening, like personality disorders, et cetera, et cetera. But in layman's terms, we kind of know them as sociopaths, and that's kind of lacking that conscience and empathy. And there's all sorts of research out there, but the one that I found the most interesting, the most useful, was written by a sociopath. And so I got so much of her interiority of just how they think so differently, and it proved so useful. Like,
yeah,
she was a Mormon, and she used, so that faith, for anyone who doesn't know, has a lot of guidelines. And so she used the text of like the religious text of what you should do as a Mormon to control her instincts and control her impulses that she has as a sociopath, because she's like, I don't want to end up in jail. Like there are people who are like understand what they are, and they're like, I need guidelines. And so for Gretchen, I was able to kind of give her a character that acts as like her Mormon religious textbook of like, these are the things you have to do and not end up in jail and have a productive life. And so she was really fascinating. And you read reviews of that book, and they're like, well, she contradicts herself a lot, and she lies a lot, and she's grandiose in her storytelling. And I'm like, yes,
she's a psychopath. She's a sociopath. That's how it is. Yeah. I'm curious. I'm so curious about this book with the Mormon. What do you remember what it's called?
It's called anytime anyone asks me like a book title,
I know.
like, what are books?
You're like, I can't even sometimes remember the names of my own books. That is, I get that. But if you remember it, I think it would be so interesting.
Confessions of a Sociopath. I'm sorry. Confessions
Okay.
of a Sociopath, a life spent hiding in plain sight. And so she talks about, she actually created a message board for sociopaths to come and post on. And so
Wow.
you get, what I was talking about with guidelines and stuff. Some, like, one person was like, I will commit misdemeanors and not felonies.
Yeah.
And so, like, that was their guardrail of like, we need to be able to live and not go to jail.
Right. Right.
So not like again, in layman's terms, like, psychopaths are more like they can't control
Yeah.
their urges, and sociopaths can more control those urges.
Right. Right.
There's actually people who don't know they're sociopaths. Like, the one the one example I find amazing is this scientist was working on brain scans and of sociopaths, and he found a brain scan and he was like, oh, this person's like definitely a sociopath, and it was his brain scan. And he was like, oh, okay, things are starting to make sense. He's like, I
Isn't
keep friendships and I like lost jobs and like things like that were just like all these red flags for like what happens when you don't have impulse control. He's like,
that is
oh.
so interesting. And then like naturally he's interested in those people, not quite realizing why. Well, it is, and is, I mean, is the interest in all of that sort of just about like the different ways that deviant minds work? I mean, it's certainly natural for our business to want to understand that, but it sounds like you've been interested in it forever. And so were you like, at the time, I mean, should we ask if you're a sociopath, Brianna? Or is that I'm just,
I would like to think I'm not.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
We need, but I mean, like, so what, I just,
Uh,
was it because you were, interested in those kinds of books and human behavior? And it just seems like it's interesting thing. Most of us in high school were more interested
right.
in like the boys on the, basketball team or whatever, but
I'm like, oh, serial killers. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. No, that's so funny. I just really like thinking about how people tick and the extreme version of that. And so I actually think it kind of reflects in like the books that I've chosen to write. It's like thrillers, and then I have my historicals, which are set in war, which is like
Yeah.
human emotion, human thinking, like what makes us human, all of that amplified. And so I just really like high stakes things.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think that kind of is what drew me to it. It's also evolutionarily speaking, is we like to pay attention to things that are not normal because, that's what's going to end up killing us. So it's like,
Right.
you pay attention to the tiger, you don't pay attention to like the trees around you.
Right.
And so I think, yeah, I'm just like so curious about uh yeah, social psychology and individual psychology and all sorts of things like that. I just like thinking about how minds work, I think.
Yeah. And actually it's interesting because there's a lot of, characters behaving badly in the book. I mean, really across kind of everybody, and a lot of moral gray, if you will, And of course, I think, in light of the situation and the stakes, and we're talking about children and parents protecting their children and protecting their spouses, it's makes it sense for people to make choices that it would, if we were looking at it in different circumstances, would seem like bad choices.
Yeah.
But it sort of brings the question, like, what do you think? Are we all capable of doing something really horrible under extreme circumstances, right?
I think so. That's kind of where I always land. I think one of the concepts that I play around a lot with is this idea that like a good person versus a bad person. And I think we're taught that. And I think as children, like, one, our brains like being sorted into binaries, but we're taught that as children too. And like we watch Disney movies and white hat westerns, and there's good people and there's bad people, and it just, that's not really how it plays out in the world. And it's like, I'm
Mhm.
not a good person, I'm not a bad person, I'm just a person trying to
Right,
live my
right.
life and hurt people, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm like all good. And I think that gets people in trouble, and I think it's becoming a trend with social media because there's no nuance there, and so we have to revert back to like, this person is good and like everything they've said is good, or this person is bad and everything, like, the
Yeah,
one bad thing negates all of the good things
right.
they've.
Canceled. Yeah.
Canceled.
It's
Which,
so
is
true.
like problematic in it of itself. But I do think that I like gray areas. I really like exploring them. I think that again, it comes back to like what makes us human. And so much of
Yeah.
it is so wired too. Like when you start like paying attention to this kind of stuff, everything is so wired into like evolution and like tribal psychology and all sorts of things like that. And so to think that we have like all of this ability to be good is not necessarily I don't think it's reality. And I think a lot
Yeah.
of it comes down to sometimes your choices. And that's why I really like Gretchen is
Yeah.
something that per se kind of over the course of the series is like she's a better person than some of these other people in the books.
Yeah.
Not because,
Exactly.
her inner thoughts are terrible, but like she doesn't act on them. And
Right.
what does that mean? Is she a bad person or is she a good person? Like, and it's hard to say
Right.
our current.
And right, does what we do in our mind make us bad? Like
Right.
if it's just a thought and it's not voice, I mean, you could argue it does, but if no one knows, well, and another thing that I really enjoyed about the book, which I feel like it felt so authentic to me, is the sort of the woman whose husband is like abusive, and then she gets caught in the cycle, and then was it Stockholm syndrome you said didn't exist?
Stockholm syndrome doesn't exist,
Okay,
correct? Which I learned during this
I
book,
want to
which
hear
is
about
so
that. I
cool.
want to hear about that. But let me finish this thought first, because I
Yeah,
was like,
yeah, yeah.
that was what I was like trying to remember what the thing was, because I had
No,
never
you're
heard
so
that.
right. I
But
had
we'll get
forgotten I put that in there.
yeah,
Like I
we'll
was
get
excited.
well, it is exciting. I mean, and very different than anything we've read. Of course, we've all read
Yep.
about Stockholm syndrome, so we'll come back to that. But first, I want to talk about the sort of the cycle of abuse for women, because at some point, the fear of being hurt by your husband, in this especially in a situation where she has zero freedom, right? Like no ability to get out of the house, and she has a child that she's trying to protect. She becomes she gets drawn into things that are she also is now sort of a criminal or making bad decisions, and so that is that's a really interesting thing too. It's like, to what standards do we hold her based on sort of the situation that she was in that marriage?
Yeah, you summed it up perfectly. Cause like that, and I don't know. I don't think there's easy answers to any of these questions. And that's why I like writing about them is like I'm almost thinking through them myself as I'm writing these characters. And I would like and I hope that it happens is, I want the readers to not have an immediate judgment of what that right answer is. Like I want
Right.
to be able to present, okay, she's a victim, but she's making choices. Like, I don't know. And then you're like, oh, well, then you say that, and your every instinct in my body is like, no, she's a like straight victim. And so
Yeah.
it's just a hard, like, but yeah, I don't know.
It's
It's
so
hard.
hard. It's so
Yeah.
hard. And it comes back to, this is a, I mean, and especially the way the world is working right now, right? I mean, all this, like, if we don't help people escape from bad situations, in the same way, if we don't help people emerge from poverty, then they behave badly. And we're like, well, I mean, do they belong in jail, or do we just need better social services? It's kind of like, I mean, my sister lives in Oakland, and they have this whole, like, there's this thing now, they don't pursue people who steal less than $500. So people walk into Safeway, fill their cart, and walk out, and nobody stops them. It's like this, there's not the manpower, the police power, there's not the, prison space. And it's like, isn't there a better way that we could just like help them find, education, jobs? Instead, we're just, I mean, because that is a huge expense too, right? Seems like we could be doing this better. I don't know. Not that, again, I have zero answers. I'm just here like you to pose the problem.
I know. Well, yeah, and it's like, yeah, I won't start getting into like police spending and stuff, but it's just like, there's so much money out there. If you look at money, especially in California, and the money's not the problem, like, and so it's just we're not using it in the right way. And I'm a huge systemic person. Like I don't really like drilling down to like individual things. So I'm like, oh, it's like the system. And so,
Yeah.
this character got caught up in this like violent system.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite chapters for her is her thinking about like, her past and like how she got here. And you really see every point where people failed her.
Yeah.
And and then she's an adult. And so has to own her own, like, when do you have to start owning your own choices? When does the cycle of violence just never leave you? I don't know. Or like, do you just never have responsibility for your choices? I don't know. Again,
Yeah. I don't know.
it's
I
just
mean, I think
something
that's
I like
right.
thinking about. When I like thinking about something, I try to put in a book.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's true. I think there's the trauma that, of the past, and that's not easy to get over. We know, of course, from war and soldiers and everything that is very debilitating and very permanent. So yeah, and that's people we send to war when they're, practically adults, if not really, their brains aren't always fully formed. But we're talking about people who were, abused and neglected as children, and then, it seems like the pattern is going to be just so much harder to escape. Okay, let's get back to Stockholm syndrome.
Oh yeah.
Why does this not exist, and how did you find that out?
Okay, I'm like hazy on the details now, but it was named after this situation, which was essentially just police failure. And oh golly. I am gonna mess up all of the details. So anyone who's actually interested should just Google it. But there was a woman who was being held, and she was trying to talk the police into like not shooting the captors because she
It was
thought she
somebody. She was really famous. It's I feel like we should know this. I have to Google it now
know.
because I'm like,
I
okay,
do too. I was like,
Jacob,
oh, so interesting. But essentially,
Peggy something. Oh
uh,
God, I'm gonna be so embarrassed. Okay, stop.
um, um, so essentially, what happened
Yeah.
was the police. I'm gonna Google the details, but the police said that she was a crazy lady, and that trying to talk them out of performing violence on these captors was her actually being in love with them and being unhinged, and like, oh, you're just a woman who's like emotional and all sorts of stuff. And she was like,
Right.
I'm trying to diffuse the situation. And so then it got into this idea of like a psychological effect that a captor could change the person who was like in their captivity. But it was really just misogyny on this police officer's like side of trying to defend his own actions against this like senseless violence that happened.
Well, Patty Hearst is the one
Yes.
that I think of, but it sounds like it was actually the origin is somewhere in Norway. It was what
It's
I
in
just
yeah, Stockholm.
or
And
Sweden. Yeah.
they,
So.
um,
Oh yeah, that makes sense. It's called Stockholm syndrome. Duh. Okay,
yeah.
it's morning here still, so the brain
Oh, good.
cells are still
I'm
connecting.
like sort of patching together like the memory of
But
researching
it
this.
but that's so it is interesting to think, yeah. So basically the the idea that somebody could be manipulated into falling in love with their captor, and then use that as an excuse for being part of the gang.
Yes. Yeah. So it just kind of takes the autonomy off of like women, and like in a way that is just you see over and over in history. And they're like, oh, that, the crazy woman is like it pops up
Right.
every
Right.
century. Unhinged, she's too emotional, like whatever. She's
Hysterical, right? All
hysterical.
these,
That's the perfect word.
totally.
Yes.
Yes. It's a
Hysterical.
word only used for women,
The
right?
only
There are
use for
no
women.
hysterical men. Yeah, I see that. Well, that is really interesting. I had not heard that, but it makes sense that and I think we are trying now, we've been trying for a while, but women are trying to be like, no, 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 we're not psychologically that different from men. Like we can be manipulated, of course, and mistreated and but we're not, yeah, we're not the brainless idiots that history has sometimes made us out to be, right?
That's kind of the thrust of like people looking at Stockholm syndrome now and being like, that wasn't
That wasn't what that
like, no,
was.
it was not like, oh, she was a woman and she fell in love with them. Like that wasn't what was happening. It was literally like she was a scapegoat for this police officer who ended up killing whatever, or just a police incompetence. I remember, not to defame him or anything like that, but it was very like a police incompetence and blaming this emotional woman, hysterical woman,
Yeah.
and this idea that we all believe in, and like I did until this book.
Yeah. Oh, for
Because I
sure.
think I went to write about her having Stockholm syndrome, and so then I looked it up just to make sure like I knew everything about it, and I was like, what?
It's been disproven. Oh my God,
Yeah.
that's so. I mean, another thing about being a writer, right? Is that, I mean, if we'd written a book 10 years ago, a lot of the things that we assume about psychology and about, well, and
Yeah.
everything, technology, the whole gamut has changed so much. And so you have to sort of be like, it's smart of you. I probably would have just written about it and been like, oh yeah, Stockholm syndrome still exists. That's so
I
funny.
I do that a little bit. It's so funny. I do that a little bit with just because I feel like I do kind of have like a layered background with all the psychology stuff. So I'm like, oh yeah. And now my new series is a linguist, a forensic linguist.
Wow.
I have none of the background. And so I'm sitting there like looking, oh my God, the research on it is making me realize how much like grounding I had in psychology, where I could just be like, oh my,
Yes.
blah, 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 blah. Like I have to look up maybe Stockholm syndrome, or I have to read a book about sociopathy in particular. But like a lot of things I don't really need to like specifically look up. And linguists, oh, I dedicated the book to linguists because I was like, this science is so hard.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, of course, I was going to ask if there was going to be a fourth book in the Gretchen series, which does not sound like there is at this moment anyway. So tell us a little bit more. And I'm curious to know what, drew you to writing about a linguist.
Yeah, so I
And
do
tell people what a linguist does,
so
because
they especially for forensic linguists, they will use like written threats and like written anything written essentially, which is evolved into like text messages. And they use it to help solve the crime. And so the most famous example is the Unabomber case, and they released his manifesto to the public, and then the brother-in-law recognized his writing style and like some of like his thoughts and stuff, and so that's how they caught the Unabomber. But there are other cases too that are like super fascinating, but hard to extrapolate from because they're all like very specific.
yeah.
Examples. And so so I just was kind of trying to think of a new series. At the moment, I was kind of like, I've told Gretchen's worldviews, universe stories. I have like one in my mind that I could do as a fourth book eventually if I ever want to come back to it. But you kind of want to end on like
Yeah.
making people want more or whatever. So I was kind of just trying to think of like what my next book was going to be. And I just kind of, when I start doing that again, I just kind of start looking at nonfiction stuff and researching like cool FBI jobs essentially.
Right.
And forensic linguist kind of came up, and I thought that was so fascinating, like to be able to, narrow down a suspect list. Like they solved a crime one time because, that strip of land between like a sidewalk and the road, it's like grass.
Yeah. The boulevard or whatever.
Yeah, I don't really know what to call it, but apparently there's one county in the entire country in Ohio that calls it the Devil's Landing Strip.
Oh.
And this communication to the police had said to drop the bag at the Devil's Landing Strip on this street or whatever. And they had one suspect who was from that county in Ohio, and
That was the guy.
And so
that wasn't very smart of him, to be clear.
No.
That is not the smartest criminal we run into.
You don't really so your idiolect is like the kind of like your dialect, but like specifically how you talk, the words that you choose, all sorts of stuff. You're not actually very aware of it.
Right.
And it's actually can be as identifying as a fingerprint. Like even just the way, and you know this because you're a writer, but like the way you construct a sentence where you put that, if you use that, for non-writers, which are, a lot of these criminals who are doing this are, what misspellings they make, or if they're trying to dumb down their writing. Like you can tell if someone's dumbing down their writing because of linguistic principles. And so like, a K for can, but then cops, they'll use a C. So like, they're just trying to, it's a really hard science. So trying to like beat it or can't really do it. But I find it really interesting is text messaging. So now we're getting a lot of the field of study is becoming more popularized because there's so much text messaging, and people are like, did they have their phone? And so like there are cases that have been based on maybe the boyfriend, let's say, has the phone and is texting as the girlfriend who he just
Right.
killed. And so they're like, well, he has an alibi during this window that she was killed, but like he had her phone and he was like trying to, and so they're
Right.
like, oh, he uses see you, like the letter see you next, whatever.
Right.
And she never
Versus, yes. Yes.
SCP,
That seems
stuff like
right.
that.
That seems super, yeah, that makes
Yeah.
total sense to me, because I think, we all have our own little ticks, and you notice them, you know, I think most of us notice them, I think, here and there with even our friends and whatnot. So I can imagine they'd be wonderful tells to find out, yeah, to solve a crime. That's really interesting. So, sounds like you've already written this book. Are
Yeah,
you?
so it's actually coming out. It's I just turned in past pages on like last week. So it's coming out in November and it's called The Lies You Wrote.
I love that. What a great title. So are you doing 2 books a year?
Yeah. This one's a little
That's
this one
insane.
was a little tight. I think we'll have some breathing space because it's a 2-book series so far. So I'm writing the second one right now. But I think just like production schedule, the editor was like, can you hit this? And so I'm writing full time. So it does, that's helpful. But I also have my historical contracts. So I write historicals too. And so yeah, this year was a little tight. But once I hit this deadline, which is July 1st, I think I'll have some breathing room, which is nice.
Okay. And the deadline is for the second book in the series?
The second for the linguist.
Oh
Yeah.
my gosh. Yeah, you are insane. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's well established that you're incredibly productive. That's amazing, especially for a pantser, because I feel like when my pantsing means I'm like, I pants myself like 20,000 words in the wrong direction and have to come back and be like, where am I? So
Oh,
you're
I've done
obviously,
that so many times.
yeah. So you're working full time. Do you have a schedule? Are you like up in the morning, I'm at my computer? You late night worker? What's best time for you?
I'm a little more late night. I usually go hiking with my dog in the morning. We have like a pretty nice like wooded area to hike in. So we hike for about an hour and a half in the mornings, and then I do try to write from then on most of the day. Sometimes I'm better at it than others,
Of course. Yeah, of
but
course. And what do you do when you get stuck? Is that what the hiking's for, to kind of clear your head and help you find your way back?
yeah, so I don't know, this isn't like a proper term or anything, but I like fast draft. And so it's like I will do 3,000 words a day for about 5 weeks, and then I have a book.
Wow.
And
Mm.
so it's kind of like I don't let myself get stuck, or like I have to write 3,000 words a day. And so even if I go back later and I'm like, oh, these 3,000 words were terrible, at least it's moving me forward. Uh,
Yeah,
and I have times where I'm like, you need to rewrite that. Like I'll put at the end of the chapter, like you need to rewrite this chapter. But then I just keep moving on.
got it.
So it ends up being I do a lot of work in my self edits. But for that
Yeah.
first push of like usually 5 to 6 weeks, with a day or two off a week, it kind of shakes out that way. Then I have a book to work with at least.
That's amazing. Yeah. So you don't end up in a place where you've like really gone off the rails. That's my problem. Off the rails writing.
I I had that in particular with Gretchen 1 was I was about 30 to 40K in, which is about halfway through for anyone listening. But the pandemic hit and I was just writing and then going to Twitter and refreshing, and I worked covering health news at the time. So like that was crazy. My sister works in the ER,
Mm.
doctor in the ER. So that was crazy. At the time we thought like anyone with asthma was gonna like drop over and like
Yeah.
my mom has asthma. Like it was just like super
Such a
stressful time.
stressful. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
was doing this consistent writing at the time, and I mean, I ended up deleting like 40,000 words. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
none of it
Okay.
was good.
Well, I think I wrote a book that then I had to, yeah. throw in the trash and start over. So
Yeah.
I do understand that. That was it was
Yeah.
outside stress is not great for creatives, you know?
Yeah, and
Well,
I think
that's
we didn't necessarily process that enough. Like, or no, I guess we talk about it a lot. We all talk about it a lot, but I do think we're kind of hard on ourselves and like, oh, we should be writing. And it's also like we're in the middle of, yeah,
yeah, a global crisis. Yeah, it's not that realistic really to ask us to be
right.
superhuman in times of crisis. So, well, okay, that so I love the idea of the lies you wrote. That's fabulous. And then See It End, and this comes out
April 18th.
April 18th. Right. So that's super soon. That's in 5 days. So actually, this, I think our show will come out on the 20th. So by the
Okay.
time you are listening to this fabulous show, See It End is out there. And it sounds like you can also, probably pre-order or almost pre-order the
Yeah.
next book. Yep. And then also, Brianna has like 1,000 books before this, right? How many? Not quite
Uh,
1,000.
that one is my seventh thriller.
Yeah. Okay.
Wait,
So she,
seventh thriller. Yeah. Seventh
okay,
thriller.
so you've got lots of Brianna to read if once you've read these ones, and lots coming forward. This is so fun. So congratulations on
Thank you.
everything and on being able to write 2 books or maybe more a year. That's incredible. It was really fun to get to chat with you today.
Thank you. It was so much fun.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining Killer Women today with our guest, Brianna Labuskes. I had to practice that before we got on, and clearly I
No
still couldn't do it. Labuskes, and her fabulous career and her twisty, fabulous mind. So we will see you next time. Until then, have a great reading experience. Bye.
Bye.